So welcome to our Global Connections. And so this is an online event for globally minded Christians to connect and also learn from one another. And so we have invited this school year 2021 about 7 TCU alumni and other special guests. So today is the 8th event on the year, and we are excited about having Reverend Rich Sytsma as our special guest today. And our TCU faculty member, David Sytsma, will interview his great father about his experience on North American and Japanese cooperation in post-war mission in Japan. So before I hand over to David, I would like to make another announcement that we will send you the questionnaire for collecting your questions and comments to Reverend Sytsma. So please do so while the interview goes on. And then about an hour of interview, and both Reverend Sytsma and David will choose the questions so that he can answer for later on. But at the same time, when he's doing that, we will have a short break and also give you a brief introduction of TCU ACTS and Global Studies Major program. So this program will end around 3:30. Okay, so without further ado, let us welcome Reverend Rich Sytsma.
Hello. My name is David Sytsma. I'm faculty at Tokyo Christian University, or I've been teaching since 2015. I grew up in Japan, and this is my father who raised me in Japan as a missionary. So we'll be doing this interview. Hopefully it will go about an hour or so, and then we'll open up for questions after we do a little talking. Would you like to say a short word, Dad? I think you're on mute there.
Oh. Okay. Thanks for inviting me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I really appreciate this opportunity. It's really special to have this father-son conversation.
So we're going to be talking about your book, but before we do so, we'd like to learn a little bit or share a little bit with the audience about your background to contextualize your work. So could you tell us briefly about your background?
When I was 10 years old, my parents came to Japan as missionaries. So from age 10 to 18, I grew up in Japan as an MK, a missionary kid. And when Dad was in language study, we lived in Tokyo. Then we moved to Kawagoe. I rode the trains to the Christian Academy in Japan, CRJM we called it, in Higashikurume. After high school, I returned to the US to attend Calvin College and then Calvin Theological Seminary. And while in seminary, I married Sandy Bentham in 1966. And we had 3 kids in the 1970s, Andy, Tina, and David. Of course, that's you. After graduating from Calvin Seminary and serving a year with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Sandy and I served as missionaries in Japan. We had fun with our name Sytsma because it sounds like a Japanese name. We lived in Saitama Ken, so we became Saitama no Sytsma. I used to tell my Japanese friends that when Sandy married me, she took the name Sytsma. I used to tell them that when she married me, she became Sai-tsuma. Sai is for Saiko, the best, and Tsuma is wife. Saiko no tsuma ni narimashita. She became the best wife. And David, your wife Hiruko is also a Saitsuma, a Saiko no tsuma, the best wife.
For Americans who are listening, that's what's called oyaji gyagu. Dad joke. All right. Could you could you tell us a little bit about why you returned to Japan?
Well, we felt God was calling us to serve in Japan. There were several factors that led to that decision. There was the example of my parents as they worked with pastors of the Reformed Church in Japan to start churches. Dad and Mom served as church planters in Japan for 31 years. As a teenager, I watched Dad and Reverend Masayoshi Koike work together to start a church in Kawagoe. And I saw God bless that ministry. I saw how people's lives changed as they came to Christ. And also, because I had lived in Japan for 8 years, Japan was home. So when I returned to Japan, I was going home. And then there was the need of Japan. Less than 1% of the nation were Christians. The thought of millions of Japanese not knowing Christ weighed on me. In 1967, I attended an international mission convention sponsored by IVCF, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Students, seminarians, and speakers came from many different countries. There were about 20,000 of us at this Urbana Mission Convention. Reverend Akira Hattori was one of the main speakers. And Hattori Sensei told us how he became a Christian through the witness of a missionary. And he stressed that Japan simply did not have enough workers to spread the gospel. Japan needed missionaries. Reverend Hattori pleaded with us to consider going to Japan as missionaries. And I felt God pulling at my heart. The next year, 1968, Sandy and I went to Japan under Christian Reformed World Missions.
Could you tell us a little bit about your service as a missionary? How long did you serve in Japan?
Sandy and I served in Japan for 32 years. First, we went to language school, Japan Missionary Language Institute in Tokyo. We went full-time for 2 years. And then after that, my first assignment was student work with KGK, Kiristo Shagak Seikai, Japan's InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And we worked with KGK for 2 years. And then after that, I served as a church planter for 28 years.
Going back to your work with KGK, could you tell us if you have any memories of your ministry there?
Well, I visited 3 university campuses, Dokyo University in Sokashi in Saitama Prefecture, Waseda University in Tokyo, and International Christian University in Mitaka. And one of the things I learned as a staff worker for KGK is that the most effective evangelistic strategy on university campuses is Christian students reaching students. So my role as a KGK staff worker was helping students form small groups for Bible study and witness. We lived right by the Sokomatsubara Reformed Church and right across the street from Dokyo University. So I spent much of my time on the Dokyo campus with the members of the Dokyo Christian Study Club, the Kiristo Kyo Kenkyukai, Kiriken they called it. So I served as a bridge between church and campus. And it was such a blessing to work with these students. At least 6 of these students became pastors, and 4 of them became pastors in the Reformed Church in Japan. Reverend Yoshimasa Yoshioka studied in the United States, earned a PhD in education, and became a prof at Toyo Eiwa University. Reverend Koichi Mino studied in South Africa, earned a PhD in Old Testament. Reverend Daichiro Furukawa became a gifted preacher and author. And Reverend Kikuzo Otsuka served as a missionary in Indonesia. So this was a very unique group of students. And 3 of them, Pastors Mino, Furukawa, and Otsuka, served as Christian Reformed Japan cooperating pastors.
That's very interesting. So you started making connections right away, and you worked with KGK for 2 years. After that, you served as a church planter, right?
Yeah, that's right. For the remainder of our time in Japan, we served in church planting. I served with Japanese pastors in Soka, Takesato in Kasukabe City, Minami Koshigaya and Misato. Those are all in Saitama Prefecture. And then in Tanashi and Kunitachi in Western Tokyo. And then later in 1988, I became the mission field leader. So I served in the dual role of church planter and mission administrator. And then in 2000, we returned to the US to serve at Calvin Theological Seminary.
So you didn't return to the US to retire, you returned to serve at Calvin Seminary?
Yes, the seminary asked me to serve on the faculty.
Can you tell us a little bit about your time at Calvin Seminary?
I served in 2 roles. I was the dean of students. I served a student body of about 300 students in a pastoral role and in an administrative role. And then I also served as the international student advisor. About 1/4 of the students at Calvin Seminary were international students who came to Calvin Seminary to get advanced degrees, studying in the THM or PhD programs. And they came with young families.
I know some of those students.
Yes, you and Hiroko were 2 of them. And some of your TCU professors were there too. Professor Miyako Iwata, Professor Motoaki Shinohara, and Professor Isomi Saito. And of course, you and Hiroko, and then there was Reverend Yoshinori Aoki, who was also taught at TCU. He was there as well. And now one of your recent TCU graduates, Reverend Ken Miyagi, is right now attending Calvin Seminary. Pastors and members of the Reformed Church, pastors and members of many other denominations too attended the seminary. And it was so wonderful to get to know these students, their wives and children. They became some of our best friends. It was a blessing to have fellowship, to have majiwari with these Japanese friends. One of my good memories of my time at Calvin Seminary was a visit to Japan with Dr. Neil Plantinga, the president of the seminary. And on that visit to Japan, we also visited TCU. Dr. Plantinga was asked to give a lecture there, and I had the privilege of speaking in your chapel. It was a really good time. In 2012, I retired from the seminary.
So just to clarify, you've been to TCU and you spoke in our chapel.
That's correct. I enjoyed it very much.
All right, so let's now talk about your book. That's what many people are here to learn about. So you worked for 12 years at Calvin Seminary, and then you really retired, at which time you could spend some time thinking about writing in your retirement, I suppose. So you've been writing a book about your experiences as a missionary in Japan. Could you tell us about the projected title?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this book for a number of years. Finally, during the coronavirus pandemic, when we were staying home, I've had time to concentrate on finishing the book. And Sandy has been a great help reading and revising. I think the title will be "We Served Side by Side," with the subtitle, "A History of Cooperation in Missions in Japan, 1951 to 2017, the Christian Reformed Japan Mission and the Reformed Church in Japan."
That's an interesting title. Is there any significance to "We Serve Side by Side"?
Well, the book will not be just a history of the Christian Reformed Japan Mission, but of the Christian Reformed Japan Mission and the Reformed Church in Japan cooperation in mission. Kiristo Kaikokaha Nihon Dendokai to Nihon Kiristo Kaikakoha Kyokai no Kyoryoku. We served at the invitation of the Reformed Church. This church organized just after the war and asked missionaries to cooperate with them in the task of spreading the gospel in Japan. So we worked with them side by side.
Could you describe for us in more detail about this cooperation, this side-by-side work?
Well, I think of this on three levels. First, on the denominational level, we were sister churches and still are. The CRC and the RCJ became sister churches officially in 1947. And the next level, in Japan itself, the mission and RCJ presbyteries sat down and planned the work together. And then on the local level, pastors and missionaries and their families worked together. In each church, a pastor and a missionary and their families were a team. Their wives and kids became good friends. And side by side also refers to the style of cooperation, not church under mission, not mission under church, but church and mission working closely together, side by side. Saito by Saito, as we said in Japan. This phrase, side by side, became our cooperation motto. And as a boy, I often heard the missionaries and pastors repeat the motto. To me, it had a magical quality. It had rich symbolic meaning. This side-by-side motto symbolized cooperation that was marked by equality, intimacy, trust, and respect. It meant that we were partners, both independent and interdependent. For me, it pictured a bond between partners that are heading in the same direction and working for a common goal. And side by side meant that we were brothers and sisters committed to each other with a trust based on a shared faith. When there was discouragement, these words were used as a slogan for encouragement. When there was a disagreement, the motto helped foster agreement. And to us missionaries, it meant that the RCJ adopted us into their family as brothers and sisters in Christ.
When people look for your book when it comes out, they're going to want to know where it's being published. So could you give us just some details about the publication of the book?
Well, we are working with Van Raalte Press in Holland, Michigan. Van Raalte Press is connected with Hope College and Western Seminary, institutions of the Reformed Church in America. And just for your information about the RCA, it has a really long history in Japan. And that's RCA, not RCJ. RCA missionaries, our Reformed Church in America missionaries, were among the very first Protestant missionaries that came to Japan already in 1859. And this book will be part of a missionary memoirs series. And the purpose of this series is to tell the stories of RCA and CRCNA missionaries around the world. Some books in the series have already been published, and they tell the stories of RCA missionaries witnessed in the Middle East, in Africa, in India. So the book I am writing will add information about another work in another country, Japan. And hopefully this book I am writing will be published within a year.
Could you tell us why you wrote the book?
Well, it's a good story. It's a testimony of God's grace. There has been much resistance to the gospel in Japan, but God has been overcoming this resistance. The story is a testimony of God's love for his people. And it's a testimony to the faithfulness of the Christians in Japan, who are a very small minority. As God told Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9, "My power is made perfect in weakness." And this story tells about God's grace and power. And we needed that because we often felt weak and inadequate. And I wrote this book to say thank you to our brothers and sisters in Japan who welcomed us and loved us and worked with us. And I wrote it so we will pray for the church in Japan. And it's my personal story. It's my story. I lived 40 years in the Christian Reformed Japan mission, 8 years as a kid and then 32 years with Sandy as missionaries. Well, that's half my life.
Now everyone knows how old you are.
Well, I'm not quite 80 yet.
All right, so turning back to your book, could you tell us a little bit about the contents, the structure of the book, perhaps?
Well, it's divided into 10 chapters. In chapter 1, I summarize the history of Christianity in Japan to the end of World War II, and then the birth of the RCJ in 1946, and then how the RCJ and the CRC came into contact and became sister churches. And this is a very interesting story. It starts with Dr. Henry Staub. He was a professor at Calvin College, and then he served in the US Navy under General MacArthur. He served in the religious division of the occupation administration. And Reverend Takeshi Matsuo served as Henry Staub's interpreter. And he was one of the founding pastors of the RCJ. So here we have these two men, Henry Staub, a CRC leader, professor in our Christian Reformed Church College, working in this religious division, and Reverend Matsuo, a Reformed Church pastor working as his interpreter. Henry Staub helped Reverend Matsuo and the other founding pastors of the Reformed Church process their petition to the occupation authorities to start a new denomination. And Henry Staub was also the one who informed the CRC about the existence of this new denomination, the Reformed Church in Japan.
It's really interesting how the CRC and the Reformed Church in Japan came into contact with one another. I think we can see God's leading here.
Yes, and we can see God's leading as the whole story unfolds. As I mentioned in chapter 1, I give some historical background. And then in chapter 2, I recount the opening of the Christian Reformed Japan Mission in 1950-51 and how the first missionaries came. Reverend Henry Bernigui and his wife Eunice, and Reverend Ed Van Bach and his wife Fran, and then Mac Coots. All of these people were formerly missionaries in China, and now they were coming to Japan. Then in chapters 3 to 8, I summarize the history of the joint ministry of the Christian Reformed Japan Mission and the Reformed Church in Japan. And I do this decade by decade. So in chapter 3, I write about the 1950s. In chapter 4, I write about the 1960s. Chapter 5, the 70s, and so on, decade by decade, until chapter 8, where I write about 2000 and beyond. And I follow the same pattern in each of these chapters. In each of these chapters, in chapters 3 to 8, I include 5 things. 1, the Japanese national context of that decade. 2, developments in the RCJ during that decade. And 3, a brief summary preview of the chapter. And then 4, I tell who served in that decade, both North Americans and Japanese, and tell when they served, where they served, and how they served. And then 5, I write about the major developments of that decade.
When I read your manuscript, I saw that families were also an important part of your story. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's true through the whole story. Families were very important. The church family, pastors' families, missionary families. But I devote special attention to missionary family life in chapter 9 and write about the education of missionary children. In the final chapter, chapter 10, I give some concluding reflections.
So there are 10 chapters, and the bulk of the book is in those chapters 3 through 8, where you summarize the decade by decade story of cooperation. So let's go back to the beginning. Why did the CRC send missionaries to Japan in the first place?
Well, 2 factors. The communist takeover of China in 1949 and the RCJ invitation in 1950. The communist takeover of China forced the CRC to recall its missionaries from China. So the CRC started looking for another country where they could send missionaries. And at the same time, the RCJ was looking to North American missions to help it in the task of reaching Japan for Christ. And so it asked the CRC to cooperate in this task. So CRC missionaries came to Japan because the RCJ invited us.
What was the Christian Reformed Japan Mission's overall vision for ministry in Japan?
The RCJ asked us to come and help them start more churches. Quantitative growth was the goal. And this lasted all through the 20th century. But in the last decade or so, the vision shifted from church planting to supporting the church with ministries like leadership training, youth ministry, worship renewal. We could call it qualitative growth.
You mentioned that missionaries and pastors serve together. Could you tell us more about this cooperation between the missionaries with the Japanese pastors?
Well, we were sent as a team of two, a missionary and pastor, to plant churches. We shared preaching and teaching and evangelism responsibilities. And for me, it was such a privilege to team up with these dedicated pastors. I personally teamed up with Reverends Toshio Onishi, Daichiro Furukawa, Hirotsugu Mochida, Koichi Mino, Katsuji Kawase, and Hirozumi Takamoto. When these churches that we worked with matured, they organized with elders and deacons and called the pastor as their permanent pastor. So missionaries were temporary. When the church organized, the missionary moved on to start another church with another pastor. And there were two methods of supervising our ministries. Sometimes the missionary served as a supervisor, especially at the beginning. And later, when the RCJ had more resources, the RCJ sometimes invited a missionary to serve alongside and under the supervision of a Japanese pastor. But whoever was the supervisor, it was clear from the beginning that the Japanese pastor would be the permanent pastor. Most of the church planting missionaries were ordained CRC ministers, and we had studied at Calvin Seminary. We were a multi-ethnic group. We had roots in the US, in Canada, the Netherlands, Belgium, Korea. We were a diverse group. The Japanese cooperating pastors were RCJ ordained ministers, and they had graduated from Kobe Reformed Seminary. And it's interesting that many of these pastors also attended TCU institutions. There have been about 35 pastors and also some pastors' wives in the Reformed Church of Japan who studied at TCU institutions, schools that later became part of Tokyo Christian University. And about 15 of these pastors were co-workers of our missionaries in the Christian Reformed Japan Mission. 3 of them worked with me, Reverends Onishi, Mochida, and Takamoto.
That's really interesting to hear the connections with our school here. I'm sure this is probably new to many of our listeners. So getting back to your book, what were some of the basic principles that guided the mission?
Well, from the beginning, the mission worked hard to follow indigenous mission principles of self-support, self-government, and self-propagation. In the opening stages, our emerging churches had no resources to pay their pastors' salaries or secure meeting facilities. So the mission assumed these financial responsibilities. The churches started out being financially dependent on the mission, but gradually they became financially self-reliant. The churches matured and ended up calling the pastor, paying his salary, and owning the church building. They became self-supporting. They also became self-governing. As they matured, they left the mission and entered the RCJ as organizationally independent congregations with their own pastor, their own elders, their own deacons. And several of these churches also eventually established their own daughter churches they became self-propagating. God bless the efforts of the mission and the church to contextualize these indigenous principles to the Japanese situation, so that these emerging congregations could become self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating churches.
Could you tell us a little bit about like the where of your ministry? How did the mission decide on its location to minister?
Well, there were other missions that also cooperated with the Reformed Church in Japan. The Southern Presbyterian missionaries worked in central Japan, Western Japan, and Shikoku. Orthodox Presbyterian missionaries worked in the northeastern part of Japan in Tohoku around Sendai. So our mission decided to work in the eastern region, in the Tokyo metropolitan region, the Kanto area. But originally, the North American Mission Board wanted to duplicate the style of ministry they had in China. And that work focused on rural evangelism. So in the 1950s, missionaries worked in rural areas west of Tokyo, in cities like Kamisua and Saku in Nagano Prefecture, and Kofu in Yamanashi Prefecture, and Kawagoe, Chichibu in Saitama Prefecture. But this changed in the 1960s. The mission and the RCJ decided to focus on urban ministry. And that was primarily because of the demographic shift from the rural areas to the suburban areas around Tokyo. In later years, we also worked in other urban areas, Nagoya and Aomori and Sapporo. We focused on growing population centers in these suburban areas. And we chose areas where there were few, if any, churches, excuse me. We located church buildings near railroad stations, and we did that in regional clusters along the same train lines or in neighboring towns. So the churches were close, but not too close.
When I was reading your book, that was really interesting to the manuscript. It was really interesting to read about how the mission took the initiative. So just to clarify for our listeners, what you're saying is the North American Mission Board wanted to do one thing in its location of ministry, rural, based on previous precedent, and the mission and the local denomination said that's not the best strategy and we'll go a different direction. And you kind of pushed in that direction.
Yes, we followed the mission board's preferences in the 1950s, but then in the 60s, we decided to shift to urban ministry.
It seems like a very significant theme, and it occurs a number of times in your book. Very interesting on this push and pull between the board and the local kind of prudence or wisdom of the people on the ground, so to speak.
Yeah, and the RCJ had a big voice in that push and pull, because usually the RCJ and the mission were together in our thinking.
Right. Okay, we've talked about the vision, cooperation, and guiding principles. What about the strategy? Are there what are some of the evangelistic strategies that the mission used in its church planting?
Well, I can think of two important strategies. First, we concentrated ministry in one location for several years. And this strategy too went against the recommendation of the North American Board. They wanted mobility, itinerant evangelism. But the mission decided with the Reformed Church in Japan at an early stage that high mobility just doesn't work in the Japanese context. Why? Because churches grow slowly. It takes time. For example, we spent 10 years in one church, 12 years in another church. And some churches did grow faster, but it was important to work with the church until it organized. So that was one of our strategies. And the second one was using church buildings, permanent buildings that we owned. And these church buildings were a wonderful evangelistic tool. They were permanent, not temporary, like rental facilities or public halls. They gave the church an address. These buildings helped the churches gain community trust. The core of our ministry was Sunday worship services, Sunday school, Bible studies, and all of these were held in the church building. I remember in the 1970s, we began a ministry in Takesato in Kasukabe City, and we started a Sunday school. We distributed invitations to children as they left school. And the first Sunday that we held Sunday school, 180 children crowded into a sanctuary that was designed to hold 70 people. You can just imagine what it was like, children sitting all over the floor, all over. And for the next 2 years, we averaged 150 children every Sunday in that Sunday school. Reverend Toshio Onishi was my co-worker in Takesato. He's one of your TCU graduates. And he was a very talented in ventriloquy, kukuwajutsu. And he used this art to tell Bible stories to the children. And the Sunday school children just loved his conversations with his ventriloquy doll that he called Kuri-chan. Kuri-chan is short for Christian. Then I remember in the 1980s, we began a ministry in Minami Koshigaya, and that was near the intersection of the Musashino and Tobu rail lines. And here the situation was very different. Our Sunday school in Minami Koshigaya had a very small attendance. The children were busy with extracurricular activities and their computer games. They were too busy to go to Sunday school. But we were able to reach a different group, their mothers. And we did that by holding lectures on child raising and children's education. Also, again, in the church building. Mothers were very concerned about these issues of child raising and children's education. So many attended these meetings, and some began attending worship services. And eventually some were baptized and became members of the church. So the mission used these church buildings in a variety of ways. We held concerts and dramas, Christmas Eve services, community activities, weddings, funerals. And so the church became an integral part of the community.
So the church building functioned in a significant way, again, moving away from the mobility model to a more permanent evangelistic model.
Yes, yes.
So besides those kinds of structural issues, what about personal evangelism? How did you witness as individuals?
By making friends. The most effective means of reaching people for Christ was making friends. Wherever we were a part of the community, in the neighborhood, in the park, at school, in stores, and even on the train. We made friends. I remember talking to a young man on the train, and as a result of our conversation, he came to our church. He studied the Bible, and sometime later, he was baptized. We sent our kids to local Japanese schools, to Yochien and Shogakko, kindergarten and elementary school. And during those years, Sandy and I were known in the community as parents of Andy and Tina or David. We were known as Andy to Tina no Okasan or David no Otosan. So our kids, you kids, were bridges to the community. And hospitality was an important way of sharing God's love. Wives of missionaries and pastors played a central role in this important area. Our whole life needed to be a witness. And this was true of church members too. The churches grew through the witness of its members, and that witness needed to be more than words. Of course, it had to be words, but it had to be more than words. I remember an elderly Christian woman who was a faithful follower of Jesus, but her husband was not a Christian. And she witnessed year after year to her husband, but he just did not respond. Finally, she decided to follow Peter's advice in 1 Peter 3, verses 1-2, where Peter writes that if their husbands do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of their wives. She told me that she decided to stop talking and instead to begin praying earnestly. And it was so interesting. Her husband's attitude changed. He started coming to church with her. He made friends. He studied the Bible. And sometime later, he asked to be baptized. As Peter said, he was won over without words by the behavior and prayers of his wife. Of course, words were necessary and they came later, but first he was won over without words by the behavior and prayers of his wife.
It's an interesting story. It's one I've heard before. A good story. Besides church planting, what other ministries did the mission support?
Well, we supported a large variety of ministries. Radio ministry, youth and camp ministry, student ministries, ministry to the elderly, summer mission teams, Christian literature publication, concerts, large evangelistic meetings, disaster relief, to name a few. And we supported the ministries of other institutions. We supported the ministry of the Christian Academy in Japan, CAJ, the school for missionary kids that I attended and that you attended. Many CRJM missionaries served as teachers and administrators at this school, and others served as school board members. We supported the ministry of Kobe Reform Seminary, and some of our CRJM missionaries served part-time teaching at the seminary. And some other missionaries served on the seminary board. We also supported RCJ Word and Deed ministries to the disabled. Ministries such as Holy Grace Association, Sei Keikai in Takehara in Hiroshima Prefecture. And another one is the Center for the Evangelism of the Blind in Shizuoka Mojin Dendo Center. My father served on the boards of both of these ministries, and after he retired, they asked me to serve on these two boards, and it was a wonderful privilege.
One of these ministries in particular was striking to learn about as I read your manuscript, and that was the radio ministry, because it seemed to be so effective. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, radio ministry, Radio Dendo. Through the radio ministry, the mission and church together made a very significant contribution to evangelism in Japan. In the 1960s, Reverend Henry Bernigge began this ministry, and He first started by having an early morning program called Asa no Kotoba, Morning Word. And this was aired on Radio Tokyo. And then in the 1970s, the radio ministry added another program, Asue no Mado, Window to Tomorrow. This was on Far East Broadcasting Company, FEBC shortwave radio that was beamed from Jeju Island. In 1970, there were over 100,000 actual listeners to Asa no Kotoba. And that same year, they had 14,000 listener responses, people who either wrote in or called in to the office. The key in radio ministry was follow-up, connecting listeners with local churches. When people called in or wrote in, they were directed to a local church, and connections were made with churches of many denominations. In the RCJ, almost all of the Tokyo area churches have reported that at least one new member had joined their church through the radio ministry. Started in 1975, this radio ministry was supervised by the Back to God Hour, the media ministry of the Christian Reformed Church that works in all over the world in 9 different languages. But today, it is directed by the Reformed Church in Japan, at least the Japanese radio ministry. Let me tell you an interesting story about Reverend Hirotsugu Mochida, pastor of Misato Reformed Church. His story illustrates how this follow-up, how this cooperation between the radio ministry and the local church worked. Reverend Mochida heard the gospel on the radio as a teenager. He then attended Kita Numazu Church, where my parents served. And then he was baptized by my father. And my father suggested that he study at JCC, Japan Christian College. I believe it was called Tokyo Kiristokyo Tanki Daigaku at the time. He studied at this school and then at Kobe Reformed Seminary. He was ordained in the RCJ and served as the CRJM cooperating pastor with me in Misato Church. And he is currently pastor of Misato Reformed Church and has served in various leadership roles also in the denomination and in the radio ministry. So God has blessed the CRJM, the RCJ, and the radio ministry through him. He's a TCU alumnus that has represented TCU very well.
Let's talk about another type of ministry, and that's disaster relief. How is the mission involved in disaster relief?
Well, I remember my dad going to Nagoya in 1959 to help in the Isewan typhoon disaster relief. It was a messy situation, but my dad worked with other missions and other groups to gather relief supplies and help all the victims of this terrible typhoon disaster. And then the very next year, in 1960, he worked there again to help distribute relief materials in the Sendai tsunami disaster in Tohoku. And then in the 1995 Great Hanshin earthquake, several Reformed churches were damaged and church members suffered losses. And some of our missionaries too went to Kobe to help in the disaster relief. And then there was the 3/11/2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, the triple disaster in Tohoku. The CRJM and the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee contributed both personnel and financial aid for disaster relief. And in the mission too, after this triple disaster, the missionaries suspended many of their normal ministry activities for about 2 years and concentrated on disaster relief. And some of them engaged in this ministry even longer. They worked side by side with the RCJ in administering all the details of the various kinds of relief. Reverend Larry Spaulding, the CRJM field leader, served as the link between the RCJ and the RCJ's mission partners by translating the RCJ communications about the disaster and the relief efforts all into English. And he made countless trips from Tokyo to Tohoku and assisted in all kinds of ways in the relief activities. He submitted his final report about the CRJM disaster response in 2017, 6 years after the disaster happened. So the mission was involved for a long time in that disaster response.
It's interesting because we think of disaster relief as more recent, but you're showing that there's a consistent kind of interest in helping with disaster relief going way back. So we know many churches around the world also helped in the disaster relief at Tohoku. What are some of the Reformed Church of Japan's international connections?
I just have to really admire what the RCJ did in response to this disaster. They were so well organized and so dedicated. Just hundreds of RCJ members went and helped. But the RCJ also used the help from other churches. They have relationships with Reformed and Presbyterian churches around the world. And right here in Japan, churches like the CRC, the Southern Presbyterians that have now joined with the Northern Presbyterians to form the Presbyterian Church USA, the Orthodox Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa, the Koshin and Hapdong Presbyterian churches in Korea. And all these churches really cooperated with the RCJ in the disaster relief efforts. So the connections that the RCJ has had with other churches in other countries really bore fruit during this time. These churches sent volunteers and contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to assist in the disaster relief. Going back a ways, some of the early pastors who founded the RCJ studied at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia before the war, and so they were acquainted with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And some leaders in the RCJ have done graduate work in seminaries in Europe. And more recently, many RCJ pastors have studied at Calvin Seminary for further education in the THM and PhD programs. One of them is Reverend Takeshi Yoshida, who earned a PhD from Calvin Seminary and is now the president of Kobe Reformed Seminary. And RCJ pastors have served as missionaries and pastors in many countries: Indonesia, England, USA, Argentina, the Philippines, Gambia, the Netherlands. And recently, the RCJ has sent short-term mission teams to Cambodia and to South Africa. So the RCJ has many international connections.
Thank you. So as we get to the end of this conversation, do you have some concluding reflections? In your opinion, what really stands out in the history of this side-by-side mission and the church cooperation?
Well, first of all, it was the warm welcome that we received from the Reformed Church in Japan. Also, I think that working with the RCJ to start and aid about 60 churches really stands out. And some factors that helped us in our church planting ministry were our side-by-side team ministry. Reverend Furukawa, one of my coworkers, said to me once, "You know, Rich, together we can do 3 times what we could do separately as individuals." I'll never forget that. Another factor that helped us in our church planting ministry with the RCJ is that we were able to contextualize indigenous principles of self-support, self-government in a very realistic way that fit the Japanese situation. And then there was the decision to concentrate on urban ministry, and that was so important. And of course, we mentioned radio ministry and how important that was. God bless this radio ministry more than we will ever know. But when you ask what really stands out, I think what is really important is people. People who became our friends, people we worked with, people we prayed with, people whom God blessed. People responded to the gospel, were baptized, and became followers of Jesus. It's wonderful to see God's children from the East and the West come together to build his kingdom, and he did that in Japan. And that's what this story is about.
Do you have any final words you'd like to share?
Well, thank you, David, for your questions. It's been enjoyable to do this interview together. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to my friends and former colleagues in the Reformed Church in Japan who may be listening. And I also want to say thank you to my friends at TCU. And thank you for sponsoring this interview. You have an important ministry in building God's kingdom in Japan. Kami-sama ni kansha shimasu.
So at this point, we're going to be taking some questions. But before we get to the questions, we'd like to briefly share some information about our school, Tokyo Christian University. But please send in your questions with the form that you can see provided in the chat window. So if you take a look at the chat window, you'll find a link to submit questions. And I'll turn it over to Morita Sensei.
All right. So I would like to ask Dr. Short. So he's our Vice President for International Affairs and also Professor of Old Testament at TCU. So to say a few words about TCU. So Short Sensei, are you ready?
So I want to first of all say thank you so much to Reverend Sytsma for being our special guest today. It really has been special to hear my colleague David interview his father. I know how much I love my own dad and how much I appreciate him, and I can definitely see that in David and his relationship with his father. So thank you, Reverend Sytsma, and thank you, David, for that wonderful discussion. I look forward to the question and answer time in a few minutes, so we will not take up too much of your time right now. I would like to say just a few words about TCU. Well, really not so much to put us in the spotlight, but to I'd like to ask our guests here today to consider taking 1 or 2 actions to help us today. Look with me at TCU's homepage. Let me pull that up here. Basically, I would like to, if you look at our webpage at the top, it says, you love Japan and you love God's world. You want to serve God in Japanese as well as in English. Then why not do college in Japan? At TCU, you'll find your place in God's story both in Japan and around the world. So one relatively simple but incredibly important thing that you could do is just to ask yourself this: do you know anyone whom this describes or might describe? If you can think of anyone, whether they live in whether they live overseas in Japan, whether they're international or Japanese, please tell them about TCU and please share this link. I'll put it in the chat in a couple of minutes. And if you do that, then we'll take it from there. We will tell them about our undergraduate programs, how they can study Christian ministry, church ministries, global studies, youth studies, Christian social work, theological studies at TCU. We'll tell them about, if they're ready for graduate studies, we'll tell them about our graduate program, which the MA program is available only in Japanese, but where they can prepare for Christian ministry in Japan, for roles in teaching as well. Perhaps the PhD program, which is more based on the UK system, but where they can do advanced doctoral research here in Japan. So again, you know, if you could think of someone, I really want to emphasize most students at TCU, they made the life-changing decision to study theology in Japan at TCU simply because, for starters, because someone reached out and told them and shared that with them. So if you can think of someone, we'd be grateful if you'd share with them and tell them about TCU. Another thing I'd like to ask our guests to consider doing for us is to partner with us through giving. To use a cliche, which is true nonetheless, no gift is too small. And I can assure you no gift is too large either. So if you would consider partnering with us through donation, we would greatly appreciate it. If you live in Japan, you can give tax-deductible donations through our website here in Japan. If you live in the US, you can give tax-deductible donations through our foundation. I'll also put this link in the website. If you live anywhere else in the world, you can still donate. Unfortunately, it will not be tax-deductible, but the same amount of donation would reach us as well. So that's really it. And again, let me simply close with this, these two requests. So if you can think of someone that you can let them know about TCU, or if you would consider partnering with us financially, we would be grateful. So thank you, Morita Sensei. Thank you again, Dr. Sytsma, Reverend Sytsma, and I will turn it back over to you.
Okay, we have at least one question that's come in, but it seems the questionnaire has some problems. But let's begin with the question. One of the questions I have before us is someone interested in mission work in Japan outside of student-to-student witnessing. What were some additionally effective means you utilized to reach the local unsaved populace? Do you happen to know if there are any efforts to reach out to the aging churches in the countryside or other locations without pastors or without Zoom support or availability and so on?
Are you asking me that question?
Yes.
I haven't been working in Japan for 22 years, so.
But the question is for you, outside of student-to-student witnessing, what are other effective means to reach local people, including efforts to the rural people?
We had various kinds of what we called kate shukai, home meetings, where we had Bible studies in homes. That was one way. Some of the students at the seminary would go out to different rural towns and work during the summer, and they would make contacts with people in the town. And sometimes they would have to use a public hall or something, but also they made friends with people, and some of the Christians that were in the towns would welcome them and invite them into their homes to lead meetings. Music is always a good avenue. One of the very effective ways that we spread the gospel when I was there was through a group called the Messengers, and they just went all over Japan and held concerts, and young people just really enjoyed listening to their music, and many of them became Christians. Another way would be to use English. Many of our friends have taught English in very rural settings, and if they teach English, they get to know people, they become friends, and then they can use that as a springboard to talk about spiritual things too, and begin conversations about Jesus.
Okay, we have another question about the book. Is there a plan to have it translated into Japanese? So it's currently going to be published in English with a US press, but do you have any plans, hopefully, to get it into Japanese so people in Japan can read it?
That would be wonderful if we could do that. I don't have any concrete plan. I have a dream of doing that.
So you're thinking about it, and there are some possible ways to do that, but you would like to do that at some point.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would think that would be very helpful for especially the Reformed Church in Japan.
Okay. Yeah, because it seems like it provides, even besides the particulars of the Reformed Church in Japan, just this relationship between the local church and the mission church and how those related, and some of the benefits of listening to people on the ground who are with a lot of experience. It was very unpredictable, it seems, the path some of the choices that were made early on, right? That were that were huge, very significant for the success, happened because there was initiative from the mission and the local denomination. And that kind of thing is really good for people to know from inside the country in Japan. All right, we have some other questions. As a missionary in cross-cultural and multinational service, how did you balance missionary ministry and family?
Good question. I have to admit that I didn't always balance it the best. It was, we had to set aside a day of rest and a day to be with family. For many of our years in Japan, all three of you kids went to the Christian Academy, and that meant long train rides. It meant for us as parents attending many sports events that you participated in, and that was a joy. But we had to carve out time from our ministry to do that. And sometimes we couldn't do that because we were involved in church activities. So it was a struggle.
You once mentioned to me that your dad took out time on Sundays to do things with family.
Yeah, Sunday afternoons we would kick back and just hang out. Yeah, it was fun.
Go for hikes and things like that, you
Yeah,
said.
he made it a practice of going for hikes with mom, your grandpa and grandma together in the hills, in the mountains. That was kind of a regular practice that he and mom did together.
Okay, we have another question. Please tell me how you think of David serving in Japan now as a professor.
I couldn't be prouder. Third generation Japan, I won't say missionary, but the third generation person serving in Japan for the Lord. That's wonderful. I just and thank God for that. And I know you do a great job.
Okay, another question. If you could go back to the days in Japan and see yourself working as a missionary, what advice would you give to yourself? Is there something you wanted to do more and did not do or had not done?
Give advice to myself that I didn't give before. Boy, that's an interesting question. Yeah. This goes back to what we were talking about before. I think I would try to get a better rhythm in my life for balancing ministry with family responsibilities. So I would tell myself to really do that. You know, I really worked hard at learning the language, and I never learned it perfectly. And I wish I had. And I would tell myself, you got to really learn the language and be better at it, but I really don't know how I would do that.
We have someone who would like to ask a question. Toyokawa-san, please, can you unmute yourself? Thank you. You may ask a question.
Thank you. This is Shui Toyokawa. I am now 78 years old.
Well,
maybe
good to see you.
Okay. Maybe Saitama Sensei will know my name.
Yes, I know your name. It's good to see you.
Yeah. One of the Saitama Sensei worked at Tanashi in RCJ. So Sensei had painted his eyes at the time. So during the Sensei eye repair, I cooperated at Tanashi.
Okay.
Okay. And then now under the coronavirus, you can't go to Japan. But if the situation has restored, would you come to Japan and again?
I would love to go to Japan again.
I see. We are looking forward to seeing you in Japan. So, and let's talk about this situation of Japan and the CRCJ cooperation and the church development.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, we have another question. What advice would you give to someone considering ministry in Japan?
Oh. Yeah, Yeah, that's a difficult question. You would have to know that person's character and abilities and interests, and whether they would be a good match for the country of Japan. I remember veteran missionaries telling us when we first came to Japan to listen. You don't have all the answers, and you may think you know things from your experience in the States, but you don't. You need to listen and listen and listen. You need to have patience. And of course, you need to learn the language. You can't communicate unless you know the language. And that's so important.
Okay, another question. Your interview focused a lot on positive things and successes. Can you tell us about some of the difficulties, the things that didn't go so well, ministries that were unfruitful? So things that were difficult and unsuccessful.
Difficult? Probably the most difficult for our whole Sytsma family was the death of my sister, Kathy. She was a junior in high school, 17 years old. She suddenly got viral encephalitis. And within a week or so, she passed away. And that was a difficult thing. And George and Ruth Young had a similar experience with their daughter, little Elizabeth. Only a little child, 7 years old, died suddenly because of an inflammation around the heart. Those were heartbreaking times, but we experienced God's comfort and His grace too. I think those times were the times I felt the love of God's people, both within the mission and within the church, the most. We had some failures. Some of our church planting ministries just did not succeed. We had to disband some of the churches that we started. And those were difficult things to do too. I think in the 70s, I think we experimented a little too much with all different kinds of ministries, and it took away from our central focus on church planting. So if I had to do it over again, I would try to help all of us to stay focused on that central way of doing mission work, of planting churches with the Reformed Church.
Okay, we have another question, not focused on you, but please tell me what Sandy did standing side by side with you in Japan in terms of her ministry. Your wife.
Sandy was a joy to be with. She was the best. She not only was good in the home with me and with you kids, but she served in all kinds of ways. When we were in Soka during the first few years, she taught English in Tokyo University, the university which was right by our house there. In our church planting ministries, she played the organ. She met with the ladies of the church in their meetings. She served on the Christian Academy school board for years and years. I think she served almost the whole time that you were going to the Christian Academy. So she did many different things, and she taught our kids, especially Andy and Tina, your brother and sister, English at home. They went to Japanese elementary school, but they had to learn English too. And so Sandy did that too. She taught them how to read and write English after school. And she made friends with so many of the mothers in the Yochien and the Shogakko.
Yeah, I remember she always had people over with these small groups of ladies, and they were doing English classes, but it always began with the Bible lesson. And these are people that weren't going to church; they are getting exposed to Bible.
Everybody I know says that Sandy has the gift of hospitality, and that really came through in Japan too.
There's a slightly different question. I'd like to ask Rich, what was the most difficult and challenging parts of doing evangelism and cooperation in Japan? So that's a little different than the unsuccessful difficulties, but what's a challenging part of evangelism and cooperation?
I think what was most frustrating to me, and probably to the other missionaries and to my Japanese coworkers too, was that often the churches grew so slowly. We wanted the church to grow and mature and become vibrant, but often they just grew slowly, and it was disappointing. It was frustrating.
A comment from someone. You've done a great job serving God and raising a generation in your household and outside to serve God. I bless the Lord for you. Please share advice with parents on how to deliberately mentor their children for ministry as a parent.
You know, I think the most important thing is just to be faithful as a follower of Jesus. I think modeling is the most important. It's more important than anything you can say, because kids pick up very soon if there's a discrepancy between what you say and what you do in the life you live. So we have to just be really faithful in our walk with the Lord, and the children will pick that up. I'm just so thankful that you stayed walking with the Lord as you have, in spite of our failures. So
I think we're out of questions, and we're just about to the time. Oh, we have one more question. So this is a big one, sorry. Why is the soil so flinty when it comes to the gospel in Japan? What do you think?
You know, there are many reasons for that. I think one goes way back in history to the time when the Christians, they were Catholic Christians then, were persecuted. And I think that has remained in the subconscious of the Japanese people. There's some sort of a hidden prejudice against this religion that came from the outside to Japan. And Christianity is still viewed as a Western religion, and that's an obstacle. And you get the combination of people being loyal to Buddhism, being loyal to Shintoism, and being very attached to their material wealth and social standing and so on. And then you have people that are very indifferent toward all religions. It's a real complicated thing. It's a post-Christian society, even though it's never really had Christianity as its major religion, because there's so many similarities between the West and what's going on in Japan right now. People think science is the answer, or religion just doesn't do it. I remember in the 90s we had that sarin gas attack, and this was a fanatical cult that perpetrated that sarin gas attack. But as a result, all religions suffered. People just were soured on religion. Up to that point, the Christian Reformed Japan mission groups were really growing, and right after that happened, they just stopped growing. So there are just a whole lot of factors that can come together in Japan.
So this will conclude the question and answer time, and I'll hand this over to Professor Short, or Morita, I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Reverend Sytsma, and also David, for today, for your wonderful conversation on the post-war mission in Japan. And once again, let us show our appreciation for today's speaker with a round of applause.